Hey everybody, it's Luciditi. So yesterday we were given the news that Prime Minister Shinzo Abe would be stepping down, and actually I was quite surprised. Prime Minister Abe is the longest serving Prime Minister of Japan since the post-war period. He was also the youngest Prime Minister to be elected at the age of 52, and he was the first Prime Minister born after World War II. Not only that, but he's been at the center of many great moments, such as holding hands with Trump for an awkwardly long period of time, and looking incredibly uncomfortable while giving a pup to a Russian Olympic athlete while Putin watches from afar. So in case you were wondering who Shinzo Abe was and what his stepping down from the position of Prime Minister means for the future of the Japanese people, I thought I would share with you some information. First, a bit of background on Abe's political career. He became Prime Minister in 2006, gaining popularity by championing the cause of the Japanese women that were captured by North Korea in the 70s and forced to become the wives of North Korean leaders. But he quickly lost popularity after a series of financial scandals and resigned in 2007. Most people thought that would be the end of his political career, but he ran again in 2012 and has been in office ever since. He's actually done much better this time around. But that said, Abe holds some really problematic views, and I'm going to discuss them in today's video. First, to get an understanding of who Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is, we must look at his family. Shinzo Abe comes from a political family that stretches as far back as the pre-war period. His father is Foreign Minister Shintaro Abe, who held that post from 1982 until 1986, and his grandfather is politician Kan Abe, who served in the House of Representatives during the year 1937 to 1946. He's actually pretty cool because he opposed Hideki Tojo in one of the first post-war elections. But even more notable is his grandfather on his mother's side, the former Prime Minister Nobusuke Kishi, who was Prime Minister from 1957 to 1960. Prime Minister Kishi is most notable for being a Class A war criminal and spending 3 years in prison for war crimes that he committed during World War II. And for some reason, he was still propped up by the American government to be the perfect post-war leader for Japan and for promoting their pro-American ideals. Which seems strange until you remember that in post-war America, our first and foremost goal was fighting against communism, and Nobusuke Kishi was a very hardcore conservative. But if you were wondering why Nobusuke Kishi is a Class A war criminal, it's probably because he was a racist and held nothing but contempt for the Chinese, whose livelihood he was responsible for during the colonization of Manchuria in northeastern China. He was also responsible for the colonization of Taiwan and Korea, but his beliefs against the Chinese are kind of astounding. First off, he believed that the Chinese were lawless bandits incapable of governing themselves, and because of that, he felt that brute force was what he needed to maintain social stability in the region. He even noted that the Chinese were mentally closer to dogs, and since dogs were obedient to their masters without being able to understand why, that's how he should approach the Chinese. So while he was in Manchuria, he saw it as a resource and exploited the men as slaves and the women as sex workers, forcing many of them to become comfort women for the Japanese military. So why is this important? Shinzo Abe is a hardcore nationalist right-wing conservative. Nationalists in Japan have many different views, but the most important of them include the idea that, 1, they believe Japan was a noble figure during World War II, that was actually helping foster East Asian independence from the Western world during a time of colonization and exploitation from the West. But in this vein, they also gloss over many historical events such as the rape of Nanking, the Bataan death marches, comfort women, and all the other atrocities they committed during colonization. They argue that they either never happened and or are highly exaggerated. The second major point that nationalists in Japan like to promote is that they want independence from the US, the ability to remilitarize, and become a more equal player on the world stage. This one is a little bit more nuanced. For a bit of background, when the US occupied Japan from 1945 to 1952, they added a clause that stated that Japan was no longer able to have a military. Well, yes, this may seem like a very clear extension of American imperialism, because it is. A lot of the Japanese people actually wanted to have this clause. That's because after World War II, many of the Japanese people felt like they were done with war, and they wanted to be a nation of peace. There were actually huge riots in 1960 when it was decided that Japan would have a defense force, which they still have to this day. There's also a lot of evidence to say that by not pouring money and resources into a military, they were able to put that into their economy, making them one of the strongest economies today. But there's also a strong argument on the other end. As a result, the United States has a wealth of military bases across Japan to to be used as offensive forces in the event of any major security threats from surrounding nations such as North Korea. But this has also led to a lot of issues where young American military men, in one example, there was a series of rapes in Okinawa during the 1990s that people in Japan were pretty upset about. Of course, this doesn't mean that all American soldiers are bad, but it is a legitimate concern to have foreign militaries occupying your country, particularly 60, 70 years after the war in which you lost against them. So for this one, I'm not going to place any judgment, mostly because it is far more nuanced than I have time to explain in this video. But what I will say is that Shinzo Abe was very close to his grandfather, and he actually took offense to his grandfather being labeled a Class A war criminal. He says this in his own book, Towards a Beautiful Country, My Vision for Japan, published in 2006, where he basically admits that he felt his grandfather hadn't done anything wrong and questioned the legitimacy of the Tokyo trials as a whole. He also shares in a lot of his grandfather's problematic views, albeit more subtly. He once remarked that he does not believe that Japan's occupation of other Asian countries during the war could be considered invasions. He also said that there's no evidence that the Japanese military had forced women into sexual slavery during World War II, despite the fact that there's actually a lot of evidence that Japan did just that. And on top of it, he holds very staunch revisionist views of Japanese history, which include wanting to remove all references to their atrocities from history textbooks because they believe that it hurts the self-esteem of the Japanese people. Let me also mention that this is not unique to Japan. If you're American, you might notice that this is a very common trend among conservatives in the US, particularly those who want to gloss over some facts from the Civil War, including that slavery was actually the main motivation for the southern states wanting to secede from the US. This is not just done in Japan and the US, it's actually done all around the world. Europe, for example, likes to talk about their time of colonialism more in the idea of maritime trade and world exploration and completely gloss over the atrocities they also committed during the countries that they basically took over from the natives. And it's my opinion that these histories are in fact not actual histories. They're national narratives that tie history to identity in a way that is misleading at best and incredibly harmful at worst. But despite this, what Shinzo Abe has been credited with is actually toning it down in his second term as prime minister and putting aside his personal views in order to try to build better international relationships and focusing on improving Japanese economy and other things that were actually pretty beneficial during his time as prime minister. So what is going to happen now that Shinzo Abe has stepped down? According to an article by The Economist, the LDP has a few names in mind. For one, Abe's favorite is Kishida Fumio. He's the LDP's head of policy, and while moderate, I've heard he's fairly uninspiring. Then there's Ishida Shigeru. He's a former defense and agricultural minister, and from what I hear, a critic of Abe, which is pretty rare. Then there's Suga Yoshihide. He's the chief cabinet secretary, and while he's great at managing the bureaucracy, he also doesn't have very good foreign policy skills. There's also Kono Taro. He's the current defense minister, and Motege Toshimitsu, the current foreign minister, which I've been told that both of those are long shots. I've also been told that most of these guys are the same ideologically, except for a few minor differences, and basically they're all more moderate than Abe, which I guess is a good thing. So at the end, what does this mean for Japan? Not much. Part of the reason that little will probably change is because the LDP, which is Japan's conservative party, has been in power for most of the time since the end of World War II, except for one time, which is actually when Abe stepped down the first time. So as Japan moves on to a new era in politics, here's hoping that the next person in power cares a little bit less about changing the history textbooks in Japan and just focuses on fixing the economy and the other major issues that they're working on now. So that's the end of this video. If you have any questions, please let me know. Subscribe if you want more content like this. I know this is a bit of a different video than I've done before. And please subscribe and I guess hit the notification bell to get more notifications whenever I post. Okay, I'll see you in the next week and a half with another animated video about Japanese ancient history. Bye-bye.